say hello to everybody on there. Hi, everybody. Our slight lateness today is entirely my fault.
Hi, Ed. Hi. Thanks for hosting, Ed.
Thanks for hosting it.
Ah.
All right, you ready?
Okay.
All right. And you guys can still see the slides?
Yes.
Amazing.
Great.
So welcome to my thesis defense for my project entitled Saying Hi, Augmenting Human Connection with Artificial Intelligence. I'm Kacy Hatfield, and this is my project for my Barrett honors thesis for defense in spring of 2022. Slide doesn't want to move forward. That's okay. All right. When I started this project, I knew that this ever-expanding technology has so many facets that could be explored, but I wanted my project to be relevant to people like me as an everyday consumer and user of this technology. So I developed a list of ideas that I could explore. The first question I wanted to dive into was, how can technology enhance communication? While deciphering methods of researching this particular issue, I wanted to focus especially on artificial intelligence, or AI, and our interactions with such technology, which brought up the question, which barriers hinder the initialization of friendships, and also how can a bond be established through this medium? Immediately, this brought to mind social media, which is often discussed as some sort of omnipotent force that is often the subject of debates of what constitutes a genuine human interaction. And people, in my experience, as AI enters the social media scene and every other scene, people express a lot of fear that aspects such as communication and friendship will become difficult or irrelevant. I then narrowed my focus down to two primary objectives. I have a fascination with AI and machine learning in particular, so I knew that I wanted to create this within the realm of artificial intelligence. And secondly, I wanted to eventually deliver some sort of data or interface that reflected some of the basic principles of establishing human relationships while implementing AI that I was able to discover through my research. So initially, I didn't have a clear path of what I wanted to create, as my primary research didn't turn up any already existing technologies that matched my objectives. So I felt like measuring individual values may be a good way to start in creating an environment for people to be friendly to one another. Modern media often references the inkblot test, which I learned has an entire history and implementation in and of itself. It's known as the Rorschach test and was originally administered as a psychoanalytic exam to test for various psychological anomalies. This test features an ink splatter of nearly perfect bilateral symmetry, and the test subject is asked to describe what they see to the test administrator, who then interprets the results and gives a diagnosis. Now, as you can imagine, the interpretation of this test in particular is widely criticized due to the extreme subjectivity of the analysis on behalf of the human test administrator. For example, according to Adam Augustine, a psychologist, an instance of this affecting the validity of results may occur if the test subject sees a bra. A male psychologist may classify this response as sexual, whereas a female psychologist may classify this as clothing. So I had an idea. I thought, what if I could substitute the human role of the test administrator with an AI or ML alternative? So through TensorFlow in Google Colab, I found a data set that utilized image recognition software known as ResNet 50 that would label images and compare the labels of those certain images to the description provided by the test subject. Throughout this process, I came to the conclusion that this wasn't the most interpersonal community building route, so I shifted gears. 3 alternative personality type surveys with psychological credibility I found were the Valued Living Questionnaire, the Schwartz Portrait Values Questionnaire, and the Personal Values Assessment, all of which have different strengths in categorizing certain characteristics of individuals. However, I felt that all 4 of these methods would be far too calculated to lead to a genuine human interaction, as it felt much more like an interrogation than a fun conversation. Thus, the second era of my project began by deeming that I didn't deem it necessary to decipher personal and cultural values, at least not in a quantifiable numerical sense. So returning to the basics, I dove into the elements that make up a friendship. The psychology of connection was not something that I initially anticipated being so important to this AI-centered project. However, it ended up playing an integral role throughout my research and it achieving my previously outlined objectives. Psychological universals, or universals that all people hold somewhat globally, are often tricky to pin down as individual and cultural values vary so greatly from person to person and place to place. So while the majority of psychologists do agree that these universals exist, the exact universals are often subject for debate. The New York Times published a study called The 36 Questions That Lead to Love, which gained popularity across numerous social media platforms. After researching the questions along with the level of success, I noticed that these questions are largely open-ended and hypothetical, allowing room for imagination and an individual's creativity within their answers. Similarly, the sentence completion test gives the subjects the common objective of creating a coherent sentence while remaining open to the interpretation of the already existing prompt. And I felt that this format of question, both in the 36 questions that lead to love and sentence completion test, which was much more conducive to a genuine human interaction as the result of individual expression and creativity being able to shine through within their responses. An interesting phenomenon that I kept running into is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, I found this especially relevant in discussions on gaming communities. Essentially, this is when someone vastly overestimates their competence or knowledge or skill in any certain area, resulting in a sense of superiority above others. Now, obviously, this is noted as hindering interactions between people, especially in multiplayer scenarios. So in order to avoid this, I decided that the game I create wouldn't rely on a point system or give positive or negative feedback at all. After all, establishing positive human interaction doesn't usually stem from pitting people against one another. At this point, I thought that in order to keep a record of everything that I had completed so far, I would create a podcast. It detailed the paths I had gone down in terms of researching the Rorschach test, value assessments, and coding within TensorFlow. Now came the data collection. While focusing on creative and open-ended questions, I still needed certain demographic information. Most notably, I was curious as to where people would consider to be home in order to account for differences in distribution, as well as account for any bias later down the line. The background questions consisted of how someone described themselves, where they considered to be home, as well as ensured agreement to the terms and conditions of data collection. Data collection is a hot topic right now, so I wanted to make sure I was employing good practices and maintaining the utmost transparency. As far as the image selection prompts, the use of surreal images forced the imaginative interpretation as opposed to depictions of clearly defined objects with clearly defined roles. The vague and intentionally representational action icons were ambiguous to allow for multiple interpretations and also displayed beyond uniquely westernized activities, which I'll display later in the presentation. So half of the faces included in this survey were generated the This Person Does Not Exist software, courtesy of NVIDIA. This is a generative adversarial network, or you'll hear referred to as a GAN. And the other half were real images of people from the FFHQ, or Flickr Faces High Quality Dataset, also put forth by NVIDIA. In this prototype, the first square, this square, is the product of the GAN. And every other square, both horizontally and vertically, is also AI generated, and this pattern is followed throughout the entirety of the grid. With these images, I carefully crafted the questions: which 5 strangers are you most likely to say hi to? And then a second question: which 5 strangers are you least likely to interact with? And I actually spent a lot of time on the wording of these questions, as I wanted to provoke the player to place themselves in an imaginary room with all of these people and cause some introspection into who they would really say hi to and who they would maybe avoid or ignore. For the story, I formatted the prompt to create a mystery, and the player would begin by choosing one of these 12 images for the first scene, one of these action icons for the second scene, an image for the third scene, an action icon for the fourth scene, and lastly, one of these 12 images for the concluding fifth scene. I found a surrealist artist named Vladimir Kush, whose pieces contain elements of both landscapes and characters, leaving room for the player to implement these images in whichever way they chose throughout their story. And these images are also somewhat open-ended and not conclusive in and of themselves. So I felt that this was conducive to storytelling. For example, a respondent could either choose to focus on the city at night for the landscape, or the sculptures as characters within their mystery, or similarly, they could focus on this mountain town as the setting, or the seashell as the subject. The second and fourth scenes were verbs represented by action icons. I used the Noun Project's extensive bank of action icons in order to encompass a vast array of activities. Actions in particular, I wanted to make sure I was inclusive of activities different from my own personal experience. Some of the activities like snail hunting, which you can see here, and dancing can be interpreted in many different ways to allow for creative freedom while arranging this story. Now, in terms of distribution, I chose to create a Google survey as this interface is familiar and accessible to many. And even in the case that someone hadn't taken a Google survey before, it's very intuitive. I submitted it to the Barrett newsletter where it was published twice in November of 2021 and reached out to a few professors to post it on discussion boards if it pertained to the course material. And I made an announcement in my AME 130 class where the professors were kind enough to allow class time for people to complete the survey. And in order to increase response rate over winter break, I asked friends and family to complete the survey as well. Now, these methods did introduce bias and skew factors in the response because while the survey was public and remains public, the people who I asked to respond have some sort of similar experience to myself or a direct correlation to me. I note the bias later on extensively, and I wasn't as concerned as I wasn't making any causal conclusions based on the data. After all that, I was able to obtain 75 responses. Now, this is a very, very short snippet of the data I was able to collect. To give some context, there were 4 image selection questions. So one being, which 5 strangers are you most likely to say hi to? That was its own spreadsheet. Which 5 strangers are you least likely to interact with? Was called the unfriendly faces, and that was given its own spreadsheet. The 3 surreal images for scenes 1, 3, and 5 were given their own spreadsheet. And then the 2 scenes for action icon selection was given its own spreadsheet. So this was deemed the friendly faces question, and this is a very short screenshot of the data collected. As you can see over on the very left, each respondent was given an ID number, and this was to further those data collection practices of depersonalizing the data even further. And each column label corresponds with one of the images in the grid of faces. So A1 was the first image, A2 was the image right next to that, and so forth. How this works is if the respondent chose that particular image, the cell is marked with a 1. If they did not select that particular image, the cell contains a 0. It was a true or false system. And unfortunately, Google Survey did not automatically format it this way, and all of these had to be done by hand. Now, right below, you'll see a short snippet of a Google Colab notebook. That was the beginning of me using the clustering algorithm to employ k-means into clustering these individuals. Before I clustered the individuals on the basis of image selection, I had to run something known as an elbow method. So that's what this short snippet of Python code is showing. And then on the very left, you'll see the graphical representation of the elbow method. Essentially, what this is telling us is the ideal number of clusters we need to outline in order for the algorithm to place individuals into each corresponding cluster. And what we're looking for in the elbow method is the elbow of the data. As you can see, it lies right around 5 to 7. And after many appointments with David at the Data Science Center, we decided that 7 clusters for the friendly faces data is the most ideal number of clusters. So then to the right, you can see this was the actual short snippet of the k-means code where right here n clusters was manually set to 7 as we deemed that the ideal number of clusters. And it's worth noting here that this was clustering or categorizing individuals, so placing people into different categories based off of their image selection for the friendly faces question in particular. So based off of patterns that were picked up upon by the machine learning algorithm, a particular individual or respondent who responded to the survey would be placed in one of these 7 clusters, and every other individual within that cluster shares some sort of similarity in the patterns of which they selected the individuals or the actual selection of the facial images. So this is the data refined even further. So after the k-means cluster algorithm was run, I was given the ID numbers alongside the cluster numbers. So this is a very short screenshot of the cluster 1 of the friendly faces data. So as you can see, the ID on the very left corresponds with the respondents who were placed in this cluster, cluster 1 of friendly faces. And then the image selection data continues as it was listed previously. And at the very bottom, I calculated the percentage of respondents within this cluster that chose that particular image. So as you can see here, around 23.5% chose A1, 23.5% chose A2, and 0% chose A3. Now, this gave us some interesting information as it allowed us to hypothesize what the machine learning algorithm or k-means clustered on the basis of, what patterns it picked up. So in the next slide here, there we go. We can see I calculated the most popular images for each cluster. Now, just because an individual is in this cluster doesn't mean they certainly chose these images. As you can see, I marked below each image the percentages of respondents within that cluster that chose that particular image. There was a 4-way tie for most popular image selected for cluster 4 and 2-way ties for 5, 6, and 7. So I found this data probably the most interesting, and this was done for every question. So again, this was the friendly faces data, but it was also done for unfriendly faces, surreal images, and action icons. And it's worth noting here, although it wasn't overly relevant to my data analysis, exactly half of these faces are artificially generated. As far as the findings, I was pleasantly surprised with the large variability in where people considered to be their home. I was expecting mostly Arizona and most definitely mostly the US, but I was excited to see that a lot of people consider very geographically diverse locations to be their home. The sample bias mainly arose in 2 forms, the first being general response bias that the survey was voluntary, and the second being the aforementioned fact that most of the respondents had either a direct correlation to me or some sort of shared experience, whether that be being a digital culture student, going to ASU, being raised in a westernized culture, etc. I also noted the algorithmic bias in NVIDIA's This Person Does Not Exist software, the GAN that was used to generate the faces. As it's well documented, this software more frequently generates lighter complexions than darker complexions. And in fact, I noticed this when trying to collect images for the survey and had to spend a significant amount of time trying to obtain a representative sample of generated images. In the survey, I also allowed for feedback on what to include in the grid of faces, as well as the surreal images and action icons, which is definitely something I would be keen on employing in future research. But what I found most surprising is that the responding population was overwhelmingly female or non-binary at right around 80%, with very, very low numbers of male participation. This is a map showing where people considered to be home per the survey. So as you can see, there were quite a few in Arizona and Idaho, the 2 places where participants were asked to complete the survey. But there were also a few in Canada, as well as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, India, and Vietnam. Now, potentially the most exciting part of this project was envisioning the future application of this data. So after a few meetings discussing exactly what the cluster data showed us, again, it was clustering individuals on the basis of image selection, I thought that a 2-way chatbot would be fascinating to implement in order to instigate these human friendships. Now, modern day chatbots have a somewhat negative reputation of either being comedically inaccurate or very inhuman and cold as they try to mimic human behaviors. And I didn't want that. I didn't want my hypothetical chatbot to mimic human behaviors and lie in that uncanny valley. Instead, I thought that it would merely serve as a vessel for conversation to aid in the ease of introduction and progression of the conversation between two individuals. So using the example of person one and person two, I created this flow chart. So person one and person two would begin by answering initial questions. This may be demographic data, basic background questions, where they consider to be home, or fun, curiosity-provoking questions. And then their answers from that would then go to a clustering algorithm similar, if not the same, as the k-means used previously in this project. From there, both person one and person two would be placed in a cluster, and predictive AI would determine not only what may be most visually appealing to each individual, but also what sort of story prompts are most syntactically appealing. And this would help in the progression of questions as the chatbot loop continues. From there, a story prompt or an output question is given to person one, who is then given a bank of images in order to begin the story based off of the prompt and images they're given. They begin forming the story, and then that data goes back into the clustering algorithm in order to further customize their images that they're shown, as well as the prompts they're given through the predictive AI. And then a story prompt that continues and builds on the story already initiated by person one is given to person two, and it's their turn to pick an image to form the story, and the algorithm further customizes itself. And this loop continues. So not only would this establish a shared experience among two people, but it also breaks the stereotype of technology dehumanizing human connections. As I begin to wrap up, I wanted to document a few of the most notable things I learned throughout this process, even if it didn't make it in my final survey prototype or the data. First off, my understanding of the influence of AI has grown exponentially on everything from patient-physician interactions to social media and everything in between. It's almost like digging a hole in sand. I feel like the more you know about AI, the more there is to know, because it's just expanding so quickly. The psychology of connection was nearly all new to me as I dove deep into the history and application of the Rorschach test, which has been referenced in a surprising number of my courses in discussions on everything from futurism to theater. I had only just scratched the surface of Google Colab prior to this project, so jumping straight into TensorFlow and PyTorch and Python and ResNet definitely posed a challenge, but allowed me to gain numerous skills that have come in handy for other coding and creative projects. I recorded, edited, and published an episode of a podcast, which gave me a deeper appreciation for creators who not only deliver new information via this medium regularly, but also maintain conversations of extremely high caliber. GANs were somewhat new to me as well, such as This Face Does Not Exist, but I've had a lot of fun discovering other similar software such as GAN. Although perhaps what I found most intriguing with this technology and spent a lot of time doing was investigating some of the coded bias and hidden dangers within this technology, such as the danger of deepfakes and in different cases present throughout history of not necessarily poor implementations of AI, but unforeseen repercussions of the implementation of AI. Cultural universals are always trying to be pinned down, but through the research I conducted, perhaps the most effective way of establishing commonalities is to maintain complete openness and curiosity to other cultures and individual values. Lastly, I attended numerous appointments at the data science lab and workshops regarding algorithms such as k-means, k-nearest neighbor, dbScan, and BIRCH, all of which were new to me. Overall, the ability to construct an argument for a positive implementation of AI in an age where this technology is booming kept me constantly on my toes and researching news articles and terms. My intention by achieving my objectives of emphasizing a socially driven application of AI is to instill an optimistic attitude towards AI education while remaining hyper aware of bias and faults that accompany such discoveries. Thank you. that is my defense.
Super. Thank you very much, Kacy. It's great. Since I'm remote, maybe Ed, would you like to MC this?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. We're going to figure out the volume real fast. We
Yeah,
can't
having
hear
an
you very
audio-
well.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
Can you make your-
It just has a like circle with a line through it. But I can see if
Okay. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3.
audio outlet.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, there you go.
Yep. Okay.
Shall we try again?
Okay.
Okay, now we got it.
All right. Can you hear me now? Better?
Yes.
Yeah.
All I was saying was that thank you so much, Kacy. It's a very smart presentation. So, but since I'm remote, I was wondering, Ed, if you would be comfortable with emceeing.
Yes, I would be happy to do that.
All right.
And if you could even plug in the other webcam. Yes, I'm absolutely happy to do that. Anyway, you got the thing on there, right?
Might be a little here. What if I? Oh, perfect. Okay.
You may need to select it on your computer to go to the video one. And then, yep.
Logitech?
Video. Yeah. Aha. Okay, we still need you though.
I can move too.
Okay. Well, yeah. Why don't you look
Oh.
your computer?
Oh no! It unplugged it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That was foolish of me. Okay. So let's see. We'll bring everybody back here. Okay.
Okay.
Give
And
it a
then
minute. Okay. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. We're having a hilarious. Can you hear us, by the way? Having hilarious,
Yes.
1990s level problems. We were joking about dongles before, and I managed to just unplug Kacy's computer by moving the television. So.
Oh, but I can hear you.
Okay, good. All right. Yes. So let me do that in MC. But let me also, since you're, I think the chair of this committee, Dr. Shaw, do you have a question you'd like to start off with?
Yeah, well, let's see. I mean, it's a more comment, but maybe a question is a comment is that I think your method that Kacy that you evolved is very interesting because instead of and let me see if I get it right. Okay, it seems like what's interesting is that instead of having like a Turing test where you just have a human and the computer on the other side, the chatbot just talks with one human. What you are proposing or have done is like having a chatbot in between two people. So it's more like human-human interaction rather than human-computer interaction. Did I get that right? That's what the
Yeah, I thought that artificial generalized intelligence is very interesting, but sometimes when it tries to mimic that behavior so closely, it lies kind of in that uncanny valley, and people are concerned that that might overtake human-human interactions. So I wanted to instigate friendships between, or relationships between two human individuals, and I thought that utilizing, the customization of prompts and images in order to prompt creativity and maybe expose some vulnerabilities with creativity would be the most effective route.
Mm-hmm. And so like when I talk to Siri, if I play a game and just say, "Hey Siri," and talk to Siri and try to make a conversation, after a while it just gets repetitive or doesn't understand me anymore. So you haven't implemented that last step, right? The actual two-way chatbot, or have you?
No, I just created the flow chart to like prototype the process.
Fine. That's fine. That's fine. I mean, you've done a lot of work. That's great. So do you think? Could you conjecture that if you were to implement that, whether it would tend to settle down, or stop, or just keep on going and going and going, and why?
That's a good question. I think that eventually the story would conclude and both individuals would decide that they had completed the story, but I don't think that would be as a result of the AI chatbot. I think because the AI chatbot is getting multiple different inputs from not only both individuals, but also what they seem to respond to best and clustering based off of that. I don't think that it would kind of plateau in the customization because there's always further patterns that I feel like it could pick up on.
And the last question I have for now is with the 36 questions that lead to love. I mean, your original project, I guess your goal is how to augment the initialization of friendship. So, do you have some sense of why this system might actually help strangers get to know each other and develop some more, socially, warm feelings about each other? Definitely argument for why this might work?
Yeah, so for the 36 questions that lead to love, the whole premise is kind of it starts at almost very shallow questions and then eventually exposes some vulnerability through people being able to kind of share what they think in these hypothetical scenarios. So not necessarily relying on stories that have already happened to them, but rather placing themselves in a shared experience, maybe in the future, maybe in some imaginary version of the future, and then they can hypothesize how they would react and how that kind of forms their answer to these questions. And that was kind of what I was trying to get at with the two-way chatbot, is that it would, start with the basic background questions and maybe somewhat shallow, or in order to not intimidate, players and scare them away from maintaining that creative freedom that it intends to kind of preserve throughout the process. So as people become more familiar with their story building partner, they ideally start to open up and they start to implement scenes that maybe pertain to their own personal values. And through that, ideally a conversation would be started as to why they were choosing that, or why they thought that was a good idea, or commenting on the other person's scene, asking the other person for ideas, things like that. So ideally also the not only the creativity and the kind of underlying exposed vulnerabilities of values throughout this process, but also the conversation would be incited between two people.
Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, and thank you for that great presentation, Kacy. I really appreciated your sharing your trial and error exploration, because I think that often people pretend that they immediately leap to the project at the end and they don't talk about the intellectual discovery process. And I think that it's always important to do that. And in this case, I think it really helped inform the work that you did at the end. I thought it was really interesting. And I have, I think you're trying to get your arms around some of these really challenging fundamental questions about how we relate to each other and how AI puts a new mirror on these deep questions of human psychology and interaction. How do we connect to other people? And so I'm really interested in both of the sort of experimental sections of your survey. Well, I mean, all of the sections, but especially. But I want to start with the question about stories as well. And I thought it was really interesting that you found that you were trying out this collaborative storytelling mechanism. It's prototyping that, as Dr. Shaw was just asking you about. So since you started out with this question of shared values, what do you see as the relationship between storytelling and values?
Well, I think so often, like throughout history as well, stories are associated with morals or some sort of underlying lesson to be learned. And also story building and storytelling is such a social experience. Dr. Shaw and I met a few times and we discussed the game Dixit, which is a story building game based off of kind of open-ended images that don't necessarily make any sense to a very realistic eye, but you can interpret them in any way that you choose. So I figured people tend to gravitate to tell stories that they have some sort of connection to, or they feel match some sort of value or value that they wish they had or anything of that sort. I thought a mystery in particular would be interesting as people like to ask questions. Generally, I would argue that perhaps a psychological universal is like the inquisition of knowledge. And so creating a mystery lets the individuals bounce ideas off of one another and perhaps expose other like intrinsic values or lessons they've learned through other stories or life stories or anything like that. But I think the historic application I did look into of like storytelling and how it is so social, but also so like introspective and personal to people. So I figured that would be a good way of implementing it.
Yeah, I was really struck by your choice of the mystery as part of the prompt. And I wonder if you saw this in your data or if you thought at all about the extent to which you framed or explained what or defined mystery, or you let that be open and just sort of see what people would do in response to that word. Because there's so many different ways you can think about that. And one of the fundamental binaries is like, well, does the mystery get solved at the end of this story or not, right? And so I love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I kind of did think about that. And I wanted to use as few words in this entire survey as possible. Initially, this was, I toyed with the fact of maybe it being all image based in order to not rely or not come into any sort of obstacle with languages and stuff like, the different languages being spoken. And so I tried to make every question as brief as it possibly could be. And I did think as far as the mystery, like, do I format each prompt or each question, each scene, each of the 5 scenes with a different prompt, or do I leave it open? I did land on leaving it open, particularly for the mystery, because I think that can tell a lot about a person, whether they, enjoy leaving it on a cliffhanger or whether they really need it solved. And I think especially if you were to ask that to be accomplished between 2 individuals, it would definitely incite some conversation and hopefully bring up the question, like, do we solve this mystery or do we leave it hanging?
Yeah, so this brings me to the last question I'll ask for right now. When you would you imagine this prototype of 2 people using this system, do they then, is there only channel of communication for the chatbot, or do they also, are you imagining that they would also be interacting with one another? Like, are they in the same room, or do they have another way that they can communicate together while they're playing this game?
Yeah, so I guess I kind of drew on my personal experience being part of Zoom University for the past 2 years. I think there is like intrinsic value in being in the same room as other people. So ideally, this 2-way chatbot would take place as people were in the same room, so they can have their own conversation. That's separate from the chatbot and not kind of doesn't follow the chatbot's agenda, I guess. And they can, and also chatbots are kind of funny in the way that they sometimes are very, very wrong in what they say. So hopefully, even when the chatbot kind of screws up or makes a poor choice in the customization of images or prompts, the 2 people can laugh at it and stuff.
I have a couple more questions, but maybe let me hand things back over to you, Shinwei, if you'd like to jump in again.
So I have a technical question, but let me skip that one. Go to this other example that I found recently and see what you make of it. It's more like seeing what your opinion is. Okay. I just read a story recently, or heard a story recently, a podcast about a guy fictively named Joshua, a real guy, but they changed his name, who's unfortunately, sadly, his fiancee died. And he went to a website that has a chatbot service, made it easy to construct your own chatbot or customize, and a chatbot. And what he did was he modeled he used his text messages, and I guess the emails that he had with his former fiancee, his fiancee, and he fed that in. He gave a little paragraph description about her, and based on that information, he created a chatbot. And so he was able to deal with his grief this way. It was something he couldn't get over her. It was like years, actually. It was a very sad story. But he went to grief therapy, things like that. Didn't work until he tried to do this, create this thing that was supposedly kind of like a, an echo of his fiancee. And the podcast actually has some actors that read out the text that the chatbot generated and this guy's responses, and it reads like a very touching script. It reads very well, and there are these moments, and the way that it's set up, it makes the chatbot seem very empathic. Okay, very very tender, very kind, very empathic. But then it's set to be mortal, so at some point you run out of credits and it just falls apart at some point. Now, it seemed to work for him, okay, according to the interview. But then they asked the family what they thought, the family of the fiance, what they thought about it, would they interact? And basically they were very negative. They said, no way, we wouldn't do it. And the sister of the fiance said it was kind of spooky to her that this guy will want to do it. Actually want to resurrect his fiance this way. So I was wondering if you could respond about that. Why such a different attitude from the family versus the former.
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that question, because initially one of my ideas was there's a GAN that exists right now that can somewhat reanimate old photos of passed on family members, or it can recolor images, things like that. And so I thought, like, what if I could somewhat generate family photos using like de-aging software that people may not have access to, especially maybe like the geriatric population, like the elderly population. But I steered myself away from that because I didn't want to generate images and pass them off as real, or have them interpreted as real in any way to mess with someone's psyche. So I feel like that's such an interesting question. I actually think there's like a Black Mirror episode that is very similar to that situation, because I almost wonder if the chatbot is like hindering the grief process as opposed to helping it. So I think that gets into the ethical dilemma of the implementations of AI in trying to, it's not even artificial generalized intelligence necessarily, because it's not completely autonomous, like it's in the image of someone that had already existed. So I can see where the family's coming from, in that from what you're saying, it almost seems like Josh seems to perceive the AI as sentient and as his loved one, where it's just a program, which becomes very very gray area. I think it's fascinating. This is that sort of stuff is probably what I spent the most time researching, because I was just so interested in investigating the dilemmas that arise with AI application, especially when it comes in the form of attaching it to someone's vulnerable stage of life, like grieving. And so it's not the actual person, but it's meant to match that person in every single way. So yeah, that's an interesting question. But I would assume the disconnect between the people and Josh is probably because his feelings and his vulnerabilities are so exposed. And then so he has a very not egocentric, but maybe clouded perception of reality and what his loved one is now, which is just a program.
Yeah.
Whereas the family is much more like realizing it's just technology.
But you know what? It's. I mean, that's why it's interesting to listen to that podcast yourself and see what you think. Of course, it was tuned in a certain way by the writer, by the journalist, and that's why I think those cases are interesting, because they're all close to this woman. I mean, this is her own family and her own sister, and they're all grieving, right? So it just made me interested in this, how this chatbot function, which some people think of as therapeutic, right, has such different effects, and maybe it says more about those people's very particular relationships with Jessica than anything intrinsic to the chatbot itself. But anyway, just an interesting example. And if you deploy your chatbot, you might also find interesting differences in how people become drawn together or repelled by the chatbot.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, building off of that, I'm fascinated by this transition you made from thinking about Rorschach tests to Thesis, and all of the ways in which we invest values but also a kind of belief, or we animate the world using our own imaginations, and we invest things with certain kinds of agency, and even with Siri or lots of chatbots and AIs that we talk to right now, we tell ourselves, oh, my phone is angry with me. This machine seems sad, or other kinds of magical powers. We think that they're more powerful and competent than they are, and we're so invested in that magic that we'll bend over backwards to make the magic seem more real than it is. We'll learn we'll learn the setup so that Siri can tell a joke. And I think that those are lower order actions along the same continuum, I think, as this much more complicated and intimate relationship that, say, this guy had with his fiance bot. And there are other instances of this too. There's dad bot. I think maybe I mentioned in our class, somebody who created a chatbot version of his father. Yeah, I think that idea of relationships and the way we invest the world with meaning on an individual level is interesting. What's fascinating about your project is this idea that people might do it together. So I wonder if you could reflect a little bit more on the Thesis part of your project, and because what's the difference? Maybe one starting point in here was, what's the difference between the chatbot version of the fiance and the artificially generated face?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I can say that throughout my project, I was interested in faces because I knew of the "this person does not exist" software, and I knew that deepfakes are created all the time, and we kind of force a narrative and we assume that they're real when they're not. So like the perceived friendliness, initially I wanted to cluster based off of could people tell that it was AI or not, but I ended up not using that. So the faces in particular were interesting because people do assign a narrative, and they do. I carefully crafted the question in the hopes that they would place themselves in a grocery store aisle with a face A2, and they would really think about, would they say hi or would they just kind of ignore it. So I think maybe the difference, the one that jumps out to me, is that the fiance bot is meant to mimic a human, but doesn't have the I don't know, it doesn't have the decision making of the human. It's not under the control of the human anymore. So whereas the real fiance may have gotten mad or disagreed at a certain point, I'm kind of curious to listen to the podcast now, because would the fiance bot still get mad and reflect the actual emotions that the true fiance would have had, or are they just going to confirm the beliefs of of Josh, which is also a huge danger of AI, reaffirming beliefs, even if they're, I guess depending on how extreme they are, it can be very prevalent in the production of AI and how it's used. So I think the biggest difference is that the faces aren't representing anyone specific. They're not, we don't look at a face and we're not like, oh my gosh, that is exactly the mirror image of one of my friends, and I know this face has this story because my friend has this story, So I think maybe when it's directly meant to mirror a particular individual, but can't have the sentiments of that individual, is probably the biggest difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's very articulately put. And Ed, if I actually don't have any more questions, since I've been following Kacy, your work, of course, and I think I have about 4 minutes until another meeting. So I just wanted to give you a chance for last questions if you want.
Well, I didn't realize you had time constraints. Did you need to leave?
Yeah, I have another thing starting in a few minutes. Actually, on the hour. I'm very sorry.
Oh no, that's all right. I just wasn't aware. Because you and I need to have a sideline conversation, but maybe it would be better to just do that later today. If you want to try to do that.
I'm not sure I heard the last sentence.
Oh, would would you rather try to for you and me to have a quick consultation about the thesis right now, or do you want to try to schedule a little time later today to catch up?
No, if you just continue on with her, I think that's fine. I mean, I've been, of course, going through the slides in the thesis, so I'm quite happy with where you,
Okay.
Casey, you put this together. It's a
So that,
very,
well, let's let me so it's customary for the committee to recess
to
for
talk, yeah, to recess and
talk.
talk and discuss.
Let David know how
Well, we could maybe you and Ed, then right now it's you, me, and David. That means we should discuss, right? Because David formally is on that, or is it just you and me?
He's
think
not
it's just you and
formally,
me.
he was just thanked.
Oh, okay, okay, fine.
So I have a proposal. What if you just sort of mute your mic here, and I'll call you on your cell, Sinway, for a minute, and then I think there are a couple of there's at least one other person. There's Lance. So Kacy, you can talk to Lance.
Okay. All
I
right.
don't think that's the same person.
All right.
All right, let's do that. Let's do that.
All right. And I can end the meeting?
Yes, as long as that's okay with Lance. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to have a
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
okay
no
with me. Good work, Kacy.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.